evening, everybody. Apologies for waiting until the conversations all started again. No, I will welcome you all here to King's Maritime History Seminar, put on, as many of you know, by the British Commission for Maritime History with support of the Society for Nautical Research and also Lloyd's Register. And I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of the Lawton Naval Unit and the Department of War Studies and of course King's College, who are your hosts. And so today we have a very special guest all the way from the United States, but once of this parish, a graduate of this department. I think we decided 2011 would be.
That's when I finished typing. Andrew, I can't remember.
Something like But he's gone on from here to do all sorts of amazing things. Actually, it's quite an impressive life all around. David Kohnen has been a Navy intelligence officer. He's a commander in the Navy. Did several tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. So he's somebody who knows what he's talking about when it comes to sea power and war. He's also, of course, an historian, an associate professor at the U.S. Naval War College, and a founding director, as I understand it, of the John B. Hattendorf Center for Maritime Historical Study. So his repertoire is large. It includes writing on all sorts of aspects of American naval power and the influence of the British Empire and so forth, on submarine warfare and intelligence, and of course, Ernest J. King. There's a new book out that you may have heard on that very subject with Schiffer Press. It's over here. There's a special discount for people who are interested or who become interested in the course of the next hour or so. But it is a tremendous privilege for us to welcome you here and to hear you speak about King's Navy here, appropriately enough, at King's. So I will, without any further ado, pass over to you with our thanks.
Very good. Thank you so much. So this afternoon when I arrived, I just want to show you that I've done my homework. I'm willing to read this to you. It's a script, and I could read it word for word. But then we decided maybe it would be better to show you the pictures instead. So for anybody who's seen me present before, when I have a slide deck and I'm unbridled, it's usually about 120, 150 slides. And we're going to get through every single one of them. Now, today I'm going to be talking to you about one of the more fascinating historical personalities, I think, in the last 200 years. Ernest J. King is not only a product of the institution that he served, which is the United States Navy, but he's also one of the early sort of visionaries who anticipated where naval strategy was going in his time. He was always operating on the cutting edge of technology. And one of the things that he always used to emphasize is that technology is never the answer in a war. It's about the people. And I always like to show people this picture. Who doesn't like to go to the beach? Right? It's a beach. Now, when I show this picture to, and I know there's a retired flag officer in the room, so Admiral, bear with me. At issue, this picture is taken in 1944 in a place called Ulithi Atoll, out in the farthest western part of the Pacific. It's 1944. And you see two sailors on the beach enjoying the nice sunny day. There's sailors out swimming. And on the horizon, you can see different types of ships. That's an aircraft carrier. There's a number of aircraft carriers. And by doing basic recognition, you can deduce that those aircraft carriers are of the classes that did not exist when Pearl Harbor happened. They were not built. They existed, of course, on paper. People had thought about the design of those ships, but they didn't physically exist. Those sailors on the beach, probably, I don't know them, but they probably were not in the United States Navy when Pearl Harbor happened in 1941. So the question I have for all the future admirals in the audience, or the armchair admirals, the real admirals, can you do that today? That's a strategic accomplishment that I think required not only somebody with the right sort of vision for what was required in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, but also somebody who really understood what the policy of his boss was going to be. So Franklin Roosevelt and Ernest King are two people who I depict in the book as people who are both very close and at the same time very distant. One is setting the policy and the other one is actually implementing the strategy to realize that policy. And so in the book, I do talk about a different way of looking at the Second World War that is not necessarily consistent with popular historiography. One of the key things about this picture is the fact that Ernest King was always aiming the Navy towards solving the old Mahanian problem of Asia. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail. See, it's not advancing, but that's okay. I'll figure this out. There we go. I got it. I figured it out. Just like a good Navy guy does. Yeah. So if it didn't advance, I would have been just fine. I could have just kept talking like a good. Anyway, everything I say to you today is not the opinion of the federal government. I work for the Navy, so this is an obligatory statement. If I say something today, it is not the policy of the United States. So with that all being said, the rest of the story that I'm about to tell you, I think, is an interesting story that is germane to the 21st century audience. Okay, so when I'm writing about Ernest King, why did I write this big book about this admiral who existed during the first 50 years of the 20th century? The reason I wrote this book is to talk to the contemporary audience about something that I believe to be fundamental to all humanity on planet Earth, and that is the seas, the maritime aspects. A lot of people, I think, expect to read a book about the Second World War. This is not a book about the Second World War. This is a book about the 50 years of transatlantic negotiation between the two key maritime empires, or I'm sorry, the British Empire and the United States, which of course the United States is really just an offshoot, right? I always tell, folks at the Naval War College, I always tell people that, the American Revolution was definitely won by somebody named George, but it's not George Washington. As Andrew would tell us, the British came and renovated our new White House for us in 1812. And if that's not an illustration of sea power, I don't know what it is. But the bottom line is, King is one of these historical figures who I discovered is part of that era. And so what I've done with this book is I've really looked at a 50-year period of global negotiation in which Ernest King plays a key part. So think of him as my main character more than anything else. So I don't like to call it a straight biography of an individual because you have other interesting characters mixed in with the narrative. You have William S. Sims, who, as I point out in the book, always signed his correspondence, "Remain cheerful." Sims is probably one of the least cheerful human beings who ever walked the planet. But when you think about what he was trying to achieve and the difficulties inherent with operating on the cutting edges of technology, when technology is changing every day, you have to have people like Sims or King who can sort of grasp the essentials and recognize how to use the foundations of history to drive the future. Does that make sense? So that's partially the reason why this book is such a large book. I'm also influenced by my friends to think about the broader context in the maritime world that we live in. And I think we should have an ongoing conversation about the idea of sea power states. What does that mean? We can have a discussion about it. I think Ernest King would have had a very strong opinion about what a sea power state was. but we may have a different view. And this is the point. The whole point of looking at history is to have the conversation. I'm not here to give you any answers today, but I am here to perhaps have a good conversation about important things like sea power states. What does it mean to you? Well, we live on an island, or you live on an island. I live on this big continent called America. And by the way, it's called the Gulf of America now. Just so you know. But I spoke about the British way of war, I think was also instructive for me to think about the American side of it. What's the American way of war? It is different necessarily. America is a different country altogether. But how do these two sort of entities on the global stage come together? How did they come together over the course of that 50-year period of negotiation, which I'm dating between 1897 and 1947, which conveniently happens to be the period in which Ernest J. King served on active service in the American fleet. So I think you're getting the point here. These guys were not born admirals. On the day they were born, they were not in the Navy. They had long, storied careers in the aftermath. But when they were in the midst of the Navy, they were still learning as they were going. And so the reason I think this generation of American naval officers, here you have King, of course, Harold Stark, Chester Nimitz, Halsey, and Spruance. The reason it's important for us to continuously reinterrogate the experiences of these types of naval officers for the present day is to recognize that they were not only a product of their times, but they were also able to overcome the surprises in their times, right? What would you do if you were called to work by Franklin Roosevelt and he said, hey, look, the Japanese just sank our entire fleet. What's your plan? You know, Ernest King had a plan. And I get into that in the book. You know, it takes a long time to prepare these people for that global war at sea that more often than not, when we talk about it, we focus on the battle in the moment, the glorious sort of decisions made in the heat of combat. But the 50-year experience is what informs those decisions. And that's what I tried to get at in the book. So in a nutshell, the way I would sort of bind the book for you is it starts really in the era of Theodore Roosevelt, who has this idea that someday, maybe, if we do the right things, we can build an American Navy that is on par with the navies of Europe, and maybe even have influence that we don't have necessarily in Asia as well, and actually participate in the global economy. One thing I like to say is that the United States has never been an isolationist country. It's always been an imperial country. Just ask the Native American population. You know, when the railroads went west, when they finally got the Transcontinental Railroad complete, that's right about the same time that Frederick Turner Jackson and Alfred Thayer Mahan and James Sholey are starting to say, oh, there's more than just America. Right? So the word of warning in the 21st century is that America has never been just an isolationist country onto itself. It may have acted like it, but it's always been connected somehow to the global stage. And that's why I think in the 21st century context, we have to take the global view that people like Theodore Roosevelt took at the beginning of the 20th century. And then within the next couple decades, his cousin Franklin is the one who actually realizes the vision of American sea power. And again, the reason I think that Ernest King is a good sort of point of focus in examining this bigger discussion is because he experienced every part of it. And in not just the technological ways, but he literally did it all, which I'll get into a little bit more in the presentation. Now, we know this guy, Ernest King, as an Anglophobe, right? For those of you who have heard of Ernest King, he's an Anglophobe, right? He likes to drink heavily. He's a womanizer. This is the historiography. What I found is a much more complex thinker, an interesting person, definitely a human being. He had all the flaws that a human being would have. But when we think of him as an Anglophobe, I think that's too easy. We're cutting a corner there. In fact, what I discovered is he's an Anglophile. He's friends, personal friends with Dudley Pound and Roger Keyes, and Robert Raikes. They're all friends. They correspond with each other. King actually claims, which I think fallaciously, that he is a descendant of Admiral Roger King of the 1700s, who was a Royal Navy admiral. You know, he wasn't, but it was fashionable in King's time to make claims like that. But the other thing that I found in his papers are correspondence with the British registrar, where he's trying to trace his family roots to old Scottish kings and everything else. And it's like, this is not an Anglophobe. There's something more going on here. I always like to do this juxtaposition, by the way, to illustrate the point. When King was here in the First World War, and the Grand Fleet was operating in conjunction with the American battleships that came over during the 1918 maneuvers in the North Sea. Basically, the Grand Fleet got underway, and Beatty, the commander at Jutland, who famously, you know, charged into the sort of German fleet and gloriously, you know, had that moment at Jutland and then blamed his boss, Jellicoe. Well, he's in charge of the Grand Fleet in 1918, just a couple years later. And during this simulated exercise in 1918, Admiral Sturdy came out of the mist and crossed the T of the Grand Fleet. And Ernest King was, at that point, a 39-year-old captain standing behind Beatty as this moment in time where the fleets, the T gets crossed and Beatty's humiliated. But Beatty instead sort of turns it into a victory by sitching his hat down, sticking his hands in the pocket and saying, "Excellent work." And he walks off triumphantly. He's been humiliated. King starts chuckling. And he says to William Pye, who's an American standing there watching this happen as well, he's like, "That's how you look when you lose." So what I found out when I researched this picture, this is his official portrait, taken in 1945. He's ostensibly standing in triumph with the biggest navy in American history at his, you know, subordinate to him, and he's a 5-star admiral, as you can see. But in fact, he is not feeling all that triumphant that day. He recognized that over the horizon, the air power theorists were already winning the unification battles. He was worried that American sea power, it took 50 years to build up and to create this navy of over 2.5 million personnel and 7,000 warships. It's all there. You've done it, you've built it. And King is recognizing that there are troubles on the horizon, even in victory. And when this picture is taken, he very purposely struck the Beatty pose. And as I write in the book, Dudley Knox, a friend of Ernest King, explained that this picture is not King feeling triumphant. He's actually anticipating disaster just over the horizon. So I guess in sort of bringing this all together, you start with the vision of sea power at the dawn of the 20th century. And then it's real, the dream is realized in the context of the Second World War. And you had all the capacity to continue governing the global stage through sea power. But within 2-3 years, it's vanished in the atomic winds under this concept of strategic air power theory. That's another sub-theme that I have in the book. One of the things that King absolutely failed to understand is the importance of marketing. So, you know, when we remember the 8th, you know, Army Air Force and Jimmy Stewart and Clark Gable winning the war from the air, where's the equivalent? You know, where's the equivalent where the US Navy is talking about its successes? You know, nothing in the Second World War could have been achieved without naval power. And yet, King didn't do anything to educate the American taxpayer through propaganda. So that's another sort of part of the book that I talk about, a guy named Steve Leo, who was literally a Madison Avenue advertising executive who worked for the Army Air Force, which is why you have the image of Clark Gable and the mighty 8th Army Air Force winning the war from the air. And then, of course, to top it all off, how do you really win the war? It's the atomic bomb, right? Which, as Samuel Eliot Morison talks about, is a moment in time where Morison argued in his book, little excellent book called Strategy and Compromise. He said, we won the war too soon. And one of the sub-themes that I have in the book is that Ernest King was always driving towards solving that problem of Asia, as Mahan talks about at the beginning of the 20th century. And during the course of his studies, recognizes that in order to solve the problem of Asia, right, you have to solve the problem of Europe first. So one of the things that I also point out in the book, there are historians who say that King was obsessed with the Pacific War and that he was absolutely focused on the Japanese and sort of sloughed off the Nazis as being a real problem. That's not fair, first of all, and it's not true. All you have to do is read King's writings from the 1920s and 30s. His Naval War College thesis talks about the importance of solving the problems of Europe first. In order to solve, it's a precursor requirement to solve that problem of Asia, as Mahan had crafted the argument at the dawn of the 20th century. So again, here's where I'm trying to sort of change our discussion of the Second World War by looking at how thinkers like King were trying to solve the older problems of the 19th century within the context of the Second World War, right? It's a longer continuum. We can't just focus on the Battle of Midway or Lady Gulf. We have to look at the fact that this gentleman that you see here in 5-star rank trying to pull his baby he's 70 years old. He's an old man. At the end of the, I'll be 72 someday. So. But I don't know about you, but I get tired pretty easy when I'm traveling. And you think about the fact that Ernest King is in command of this navy of nearly 7,000 warships. He's using intelligence in ways that had never been used like that before. You know, but we can talk about the Bletchley Park part of this. But King built a place called Nebraska Avenue in 1943, which was, I'm going to say something that you'll probably run me out of the place. Yeah, so in 1942, the blackout of 1942 at Bletchley Park, Bletchley was unable to solve four-rotor cipher on a consistent basis in a timely enough way to make the information useful. And of course, this coincides with the early forays of the German submarines along the American coast. And it does create a problem. But in the context of that problem, the American cryptologist Lawrence Safford said that the British aren't telling us the full truth. He said, we're exchanging our Japanese intelligence JN-25B and our purple diplomatic cipher information with the British as part of the deal that was struck in 1938-39. But the British are not telling us the full truth. The British are not reading German naval traffic. That's what Lawrence Safford said to Ernest King, and King said, oh. So there was a showdown in the fall of 1942. Edward Travis of Bletchley Park went to Washington, D.C. and met with Joseph Wenger, U.S. Navy, and Carl Holden, who knew nothing about cryptography, but he was in charge of cryptography. He was a battleship sailor. And Ernest King gave an initial sort of introduction. He said, look, we understand that you guys were solving the codes, but you're not anymore, are you? And the British said, well, yeah, we're having some difficulties. And that's when they really hashed it out. And that's what became known as the Holden Agreement. That's the first step in what became the Bruce Agreement of 1943, British-US agreement. And that is the basis for what we today call the Five Eyes UK-US agreement. And it all starts with King. I learned a lot along my long and winding path with my friend Ernie King. I shouldn't say that, should I? But I do joke about it. My journey with Ernie was many years in the making. And I had finished this book at least 3 times before I actually finished the book. One of the things I found out in my quote journey with Ernie is there are still materials that no historian has ever seen. There's material spread everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And one of the coolest things that I had the pleasure of getting to sort of look at is his sea chest, which stays in the family. And there's some amazing material that remain in the family, to include, you know, those Christmas cards and postcards from British friends that give you that other sort of lens through which you can consider Ernest King. And of course, you know, you can see the hubris of this 5-star admiral, can't you? In the bath towel. I mean, his bath towel has his rank depicted on it. I mean, that's somebody with an ego, I think, right? And it also sort of connects you to the person too. You know, there's a mythology about King not having a sense of humor. I've found just the opposite. He had a tremendous sense of humor, but it's a very wry sense of humor. He was tough. He was a tough boss. He had expectations. He expected you to do the job. And if you asked for help, he would just look at you and he would turn away and walk away. He expected you to solve the problem, take the initiative. If you didn't take the initiative, he would fire you. If you asked for help, he would fire you. He expected naval officers to recognize a problem, understand what was required, and then fix the problem on their own. So there's some interesting sort of personality quirks that I think I've tried to, you know, really address in detail within the context of the book, that does run against the sort of prevailing interpretations of King being, you know, Anglophobe, you know, a drunk. He's not a drunk. I mean, he was at the beginning of his career in China when, you know, he was a young man. He had a good time in China. He very much did. And, you know, what happened for King was he missed ship's movement in China. He was so drunk that he had to crawl up the gangway. He could barely walk, and he was written up and nominated for dismissal from the service, which is why he was sent back to the United States in 1904, and he had to face the retention board. And Admiral Stockton, the president of Naval War College, made Ernest King read his fitness reports to the board. And the other part of this is that King was an excellent sailor on board ship, but if you let him go ashore, he was getting into trouble all the time. So he had taken the exam to promote to lieutenant, and he aced the exam. So he's professionally right there. But Admiral Stockton, this is early in King's career, said, look, if you're planning to have a naval career, you cannot behave this way. You need to get married, you need to be a model naval officer. And he invited King out of the room, and King thought, well, that's the end of my naval career, you know, early on. When he was invited back into the room, it was kind of like the Viva, Andrew. When I'm like, okay, I'm done, it's over. when he was invited back into the room, Admiral Stockton had a sense of humor, and he said, look, we're gonna promote you to lieutenant. Your first assignment is officer in charge of discipline at the Naval Academy. So 1905 is a big year for Ernest King. Not only is he getting married, but he has 7 children with Maddie, his wife. They're a happy family. His son, Ernest King Jr., is born in 1922. During this period of 1904 to 1922, they have these 7 kids. They end up having nearly 14 grandkids. It's a tight-knit family. And, you know, we can have a bigger discussion of the culture of the service at the time, but, you know, there were rules. And one of the things that I discovered in my research is you can see where this individual is growing up within the context of the service culture, and he's becoming a reflection of it, right? And that's one of the things I've tried to do with the book, is to use King's story to sort of flesh out how American sea power evolves during that 50-year period, which is why it's nearly a 700-page book. And I can't say enough about the publisher Schiffer. Were excellent to work with. And my good friend John Stone, the editor, when I said, yeah, I've got like 12 appendices that I want to include, he didn't bat an eye. Didn't bat an eye. And then I said, well, I've got about 60 pictures that I want to include. Didn't bat an eye. And the book is beautifully published and you know, wonderful paper. And I think for a naval officer of 5-star rank like Ernest King, I think, you know, the quality of the book, I can't say enough about, and I think it's a great reflection of the importance of Ernest King as well. Now, is this the last book about Ernest King? I hope not. I mean, it's 700 odd pages, and there's a lot on the cutting room floor. There's a lot that I couldn't cover, which is something I've corresponded with other historians about. Well, why didn't you talk about Paukenschlag, you know, Operation Drumbeat, and the U-boat campaign along the coast? I did. It's in there, but I don't go down into the periscope with you, and I don't fight the battles with you. That's King's War. He's not the battlefield commander. He's not Admiral Halsey. He's Halsey's boss. He's the guy setting the priorities on the global stage, and it is a global war, which is another reason I attacked Ernest King the way that I did. He's not thinking about the Atlantic and the Pacific as separate fronts. He's thinking about the Atlantic and Pacific as the main lines of effort to support offensive operations on the continental side of things of Europe and Asia. He's looking at a global war at sea, and that's how he's thinking about it, which is why I spent so much time and effort in the book to paint this global picture. There's a part of the book where I show you he goes to Normandy to review the situation at Normandy. Admiral Kirk, one of his, when he was officer in charge of discipline at the Naval Academy, Kirk was a midshipman who almost got kicked out of the Naval Academy, but for the fact that King sort of saved his career. Chester Nimitz is also running around the Naval Academy as a young ensign. And King develops his relationship early on, 1905, which carries through the Second World War. These guys knew each other. And when he goes to Normandy and Kirk says, sure, would you like a pistol? King just looked at him and said, don't you have control here? That's the way King would sort of convey his thoughts. You know, Kirk kind of sheepishly, you know, sorry, sir. After Normandy, he gets on an airplane, flies all the way to Washington, D.C., has a bite to eat, gets back on the airplane, flies out to San Francisco, meets with Admiral Ingersoll, and then he goes out to Saipan within a 2-week period. Think about it, you know, he's 66, 67 years old. Fighting that war, he's showing him, he's the commander. The other thing that I point out in the book is that King's presence was known throughout the Navy. Everybody knew who was in charge of that Navy. And it wasn't Chesterton. It was Ernest King. A lot of people begrudgingly respected Ernest King because of the command presence that he was able to sort of convey. One thing before I leave this slide, this is a really nice moment in my experience. I've had the privilege to get to know a lot of the descendants of key admirals of the past. Ernest King's family came to the Naval War College. And this is the office in which Bradley Fisk thought about the creation of the Chief of Naval Operations job. It's also the office in which Mahan sort of jotted down some notes about strategy. And it's the office at one point that we had the portrait of Ernest King, and this is all his grandkids when they came to visit the War College. That was a really neat moment. We also have an ongoing relationship with Nathaniel Sims. So one of the other things that I'll sort of stress about the book is there are material that the families have provided, which I've been able to feature in the book, to include some interesting photographs as well. Just to sort of give you the family sense. One of the other things that I learned about Ernest King is he was really into the technology. He actually had this automobile early on. He took the whole thing apart just to figure out how it worked, which kind of tells you a little something about how these guys sort of educated themselves. So I'm going to close with this slide, because this is how I think Ernest King can still sort of inform how we approach things in life to the 21st century sort of context of things. Should we be worried about the future? Yes, of course. Does anybody in the room know what the future holds? No. Can history help us anticipate what the future holds? Yes. And this piece of advice from Ernest King, I think, helps think about how we overcome the challenges of the present day, right? You just got to think about it. You got to plan for it. And when the opportunity comes, you got to seize that opportunity. And it's that type of an attitude that I think is what got Ernest King to the 5-star levels that he attained in the context of the Second World War. But the most important aspect of understanding why I think Ernest King still offers something for us today in the 21st century context is the fact that it was a 50-year chronology. It wasn't a single battle. It wasn't a single decision that gets made and books get written about. It's a much more broader process of experience that comes together with higher rank and higher responsibility. And by the time he's reaching the end of his career, he's really a key architect in what we now remember collectively as this special relationship between the United States and of course Britain. And I'm obviously a firm believer in the special relationship, and it's not just because I'm a Beatles fan. So with that, thank you very much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed this. There's a whole bunch more slides I can show you, but I think I'll close it there so we can maybe have a conversation if you have any questions.
I know you could have done it, we asked for what we got and we're happy forward. There's some notice. I'll check to see if there's some questions online in a moment, but I'm sure with this number of people, there are on the floor. So at the back, and then here. Yeah. Go ahead, Jason.
Dave, if I was to peruse the Library of Congress or look at 50 years of probably naval stories of the United States studying the US Navy, I find plenty of holes, even myths, numerous admirals. With your book, I only think there's one other. What's the story? Why is the head of the US Navy in the Second World War only covered in your novel? What's the story? What's going on here? Why is there anything not discussed?
That's an interesting question. I think one of the hard parts with Ernest King is how complex the story actually is. How do you frame it? And, for those of you who do know me, I mean, I've been grappling with Ernest King for most of my career. I think I first jotted his name down in roughly 1995. And he's a complex problem in history. And there's so much written about Ernest King and his Navy, but there's very little substance that's very, sufficiently developed in the historiography. You get the White Hill volume in 1952. Ernest King participates in that. It's as thick as my book, but the problem with that book is it's written like a phone book. It's very unreadable. It's all facts. It's a true reflection of Ernest King. The other problem, of course, in 1952, King can't talk about things like Ultra, the Enigma cipher, or any of that aspect of the war, which is crucial to understanding how the Second World War, and for that matter, the First World War, were conducted. So all of that history was inaccessible in an open forum. Now, the other day at Greenwich, Ian will recall that I had a slide up about how memoirs, if you read the memoirs correctly, the secret's right there, hidden in plain sight. U-boat gets sunk because of radar or whatever. Well, that's actually cryptologic. We now know. So when Tom Buell later on was trying to grapple with Ernest King, he also ran into the same types of problems in framing this really complex personality. And I will tell you, I had difficulty in framing this whole thing. And I think the moment I was able to start grappling with King in a useful way is when I decided it's not a straight biography. I mean, there are biographical aspects of the book, which you can't escape. I came to the recognition that King is part of a tribal culture. And when I realized that this tribal culture was analogous to a cannibal tribe in the jungle, and they're eating their own, King is the king cannibal by the end of it, And when I started seeing King as a reflection of the institution and culture of the time, that's how I sort of started to see Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt as the convenient bookends to studying this 50-year period in history. I'm trying to be provocative a little bit, maybe too much so, but I am trying to erase this notion of World War I and World War II being separate events in history, because if you follow the biographies of the people who fought those wars, they're interconnected. King is coming out of the post-Civil War Reconstruction period, Gilded Age, and he's experiencing everything that goes through the Great Gatsby years up to the Atomic Age, into the early part of the Space Age. So when you look at the human experience in a holistic way, you can see that it requires a 50-year approach, which is why I don't necessarily get into the Battle of Midway in any serious detail, but I do get into key decisions in battles like that. Like, why is it called the Doolittle raid? It's because he did not recognize the importance of getting the message out to the American taxpayer that, hey, that is a naval operation that is planned by and executed by the Navy. But the Air Force was able to rebrand it the Doolittle raid.
Oh, right.
Right?
You have a question from a fellow deadhead over there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and then to you, first, yeah.
Sorry, me.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, this is actually more about strategy in War II rather than in the map. I did hear it was suggested by an American historian that there was a certain body of opinion in the Navy, in the US Navy, thought that the American ought to be targeting sort of South China.
Mhm.
And instead of which, of course, MacArthur wanted to go to the Philippines.
Yep.
And if they'd gone to South China instead, and focused on that, the opportunity to knock off
Not of Japan. It was brilliant. It was opportunity to load down the Chinese nationalists with plenty of weaponry. And of course, the Chinese nationalists were engaged in half the Japanese army.
Right.
And would possibly shorten the war in the Pacific. And not end sort of General Grove's golden age of, you know, actually nuking somebody, quite keen to do. Have you got any, I mean, do you know anything about that? Is that?
So, yeah, I thank you for this question because it does, help me, illustrate another part of the book that, I think is important. King's entire view of the global war at sea was that the four policemen principle of Franklin Roosevelt required the construction of Europe and Asia in a different post-imperial way under the United Nations. And so the four policemen under Roosevelt's sort of utopian dream are the United States and Britain, the sea powers working together, and the Soviet Union and China working on the continental side, fighting the actual armies of National Socialist Italy and China and the Japanese. So King's whole view was, I'm not gonna put American or British troops ashore if I don't have to. We're just gonna enable the Russians and the Chinese to fight the Nazis and the Japanese. And we'll use sea power to enable that. And King really did not think it was necessary to go across the Rhine, for example. Just let the Soviets deal with it and they can just fight that battle and they'll be so tired that, you know, our industrial strength will enable us to sustain the peacetime end under the United Nations. That's the way he looked at it. It didn't pan out that way, of course. But the fact of the matter is, and I devote some significant space in the book to the effort of Milton Miles, who was King's man in China. More than 5,000 United States Navy sailors are operating in China, starting in 1942, and it's a major front in the Pacific War, but it's rarely talked about. And the whole Causeway campaign plan through the Central Pacific culminated in Formosa. Now, if you look at the European theater, all you have to do is read King's thesis from 1933. He talks about the citadels, he calls them the citadels of the UK, the British Home Islands in Europe, and Formosa in Asia. If you hold those citadels, you own Europe and Asia. That's what he writes in his thesis, 10 years before he's executing that strategy on the global stage. So the war in Asia, I think, is a lost victory of sorts, because so little has been written about it. But it also, I think, enables us to see what King was actually trying to do with naval power, by you know, getting the beer out to the beach to those sailors that I showed you before. Where are they going? What they're doing is they're trying to open up those lines of communication to enable the Chinese to fight the Japanese, so that we wouldn't have to commit our forces to the ground effort. So it's a different way of thinking about World War II, I think.
Was it MacArthur who sort of guided it?
No, I think. Well, MacArthur definitely had a point of view, and I will go ahead and, I have something for you on that. Let's see here. MacArthur is one of these guys that King bumps into in the First World War. And King recalled meeting MacArthur on the Western Front. Doug was every bit a military man and had a very impressive face. But there was something missing behind it. He spoke in Shakespearean soliloquies. He never had a conversation with anyone but himself. Doug cannot actually walk on water. That's King's impression of Doug MacArthur. King had a great deal of respect for MacArthur's brother, Arthur, who was in the Navy, who died of a heart attack. But it's an interesting, these cast of characters are interesting to examine in how they either got along or didn't get along, but they were able to somehow figure out a way to collaborate. The whole Philippines strategy discussion is an interesting one. I would say that King decided to support the Philippines effort because it was easier in that immediate moment. Formosa, the assessment was that the Formosa problem was still too hard to get to, and because the Japanese thought that the Americans were going to go for Formosa first, and because we were able to obtain a copy of the Japanese defense plan before what unfolded at Lady Gulf, we had the Japanese plan. And we had real-time communications access to the Japanese traffic that we were able to disseminate through the numbered fleet system that was created in 1943, which I talk about in the book. The XCOM circuit, which connected Washington, D.C. to the individual seagoing fleet, numbered fleet intelligence officer, was a real, it's not like we have today with the internet, but it's as close as you can get. By that point in the Second World War, we did have the capability to flex. And so when you think about the Philippine decision, first of all, it's a political decision by Roosevelt. It's an election year, right? You want to keep MacArthur in the Philippines if you keep him out there as long as you can, because, I'm running for office. That's part of the decision-making process. But it's also a very practical decision because we have access to the Japanese plan. We know Formosa is too hard to take now, so let's go ahead and put MacArthur ashore. And to quote William J. Sebald, who's one of the intelligence officers who's working for King, he described the objective at the Battle of Lady Gulf was really just to get a photograph of MacArthur with his pants wet, which they did. Of course, when he marches ashore, and that whole history, I did talk about that in some detail in the book as well.
Okay, we've got a slight queue forming. I wonder if we could start online. We've had concern about the pictures not being available, and I can't think how that could happen. So if anybody online has any insights into that, first of all, I apologize, but pop it into the chat. But we do have a question about King's reputation. I think it echoes an earlier question. What gives? Why doesn't he have the same reputation as Nimitz and the others?
Well, I think, thanks for the question. Tom's a good guy. I appreciate the question. It's a hard one to get to. I think when you look at a personality like Ernest King, he is a salty, old school Navy kind of guy, and he takes very seriously your lineal standing. So if you're not on his equal lineal standing, he's not necessarily going to pay attention to you. But that's kind of a product of the times as well. A lot of military leaders were like that back then. So I think when we think about a Spruance or a Nimitz, first of all, Spruance just looks pretty good, right? He's got a great reputation for being the quote quiet warrior, making sound decisions when you needed to make a sound decision. And King actually refers to Spruance as the best officer in the Navy, bar none. That's how King thought of Spruance. Why Spruance doesn't become chief of naval operations or a 5-star admiral, I think that's something that we can talk about as well, because that's, again, where politics comes into play. Chester Nimitz is a different sort of character as well. He's kind of he's got the Texas accent going for him. He's perfectly happy to talk to the media. He's easier to sort of glorify. He's playing horseshoes with sailors out by the beach. He's doing those kinds of things. That's not something that somebody like Ernest King would ever dream of doing. But those who knew King best knew him, once you were able to gain his trust, knew him as a very sort of jolly person. But it took, he had this sort of suit of armor that he wore throughout his career and his life that I think historians in the aftermath found to be pretty much unpenetrable. And I think still to this day, it's hard to get to the real core of who Ernest King was. I've done the best I could in 700 odd pages, but as I said, I think there will be another book about Ernest King in the future, and I would look forward to reading it because there's still so much that we can learn. But in my case, I'm arguing that King is a reflection of this period of American promise, where the Americans saw themselves in the global maritime arena, as I like to call it, this idea of American sea power. And one thing that can I read this real quick?
But the whole thing.
No. So I did do my homework, just so you know. I wrote this out. I always like to close it with something that King would say in his valedictory address, in the final address before the stroke that took his voice in 1947. King observed, quote, "No matter how ingenious the war machines, no matter how marvelous the developments of science, we must always remember that the wars of the future, if more wars there must be, will be similar to the wars of the past." Looking outward to the future, King thought, quote, "We must, if you like, paraphrase the phrase waging war. Why should we not make as much effort to win the peace as we do to win the war? Why should we not wage peace?" I like it. That's pretty good stuff. I think that encapsulates what navies in particular are good at doing. We can wage peace. If you do naval strategy right, you won't have the war. And if an enemy is stupid enough to start the war, well, look what we were able to do. We put 2 sailors on the beach with a cold beer in their hand within 18 months. Right? So don't pick a fight with the US Navy, right? That's the message.
We did have a question against the window, yes? Yeah.
Well, it's all right, I think it's been answered.
It's been answered, okay, Tina.
If I can go to the immediate post-war period, and I'm not sure how it relates to his retirement, but the formation of the US Air Force, did he have any input in discussions with, obviously he was an aviator himself, was there any risk that the US Navy aviation would go the same way as RNAS immediately after First World, formation of the RAF, well, 20 odd years, no naval aviation? Was that a risk, and is that something he had input in, or relation with the other 5 stars like Arnold and that post-war period with the Air Force creation?
So I'm gonna pay you after for asking this question. It's a very important question. King certainly had some deep thoughts about what air power is supposed to be. And he was definitely of the mindset that the future was going to be one that included air power. But if your argument is to unify the Army and the Navy into a single service, but then ironically perhaps argue that there should be a separate Air Force, King was perplexed by this argument. And I do spend a lot of time in the book talking about King's thoughts about air power. And the one thing that he does say in Congress is that there are 2 surfaces on planet Earth. One is land and the other is sea. The air transcends both, but land and sea are completely different environments, and you do have to have certain capabilities at sea that you don't necessarily need ashore, and the same goes for land-based. One of the things that I talk about in the book is in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, King is very upset that Admiral Kimmel and Admiral Stark are being scapegoated publicly for the disaster at Pearl Harbor, when in fact, under the joint Army-Navy agreement on air power, I think 1937, the Army very strongly said, we control all land-based air. And as part of this deal, the Army also assumed responsibility for defending ships in port. So, and the Army also controlled all of the communications lines to Hawaii, so the Navy couldn't even get access to key communications between Washington and Pearl Harbor. So early on, right after the Pearl Harbor disaster, the first thing that happens when King shows up from Newport, he actually comes down from Newport, Rhode Island, where he was in command of the Atlantic Fleet, gets off the train with his aide, he goes home that evening, and King drives, he actually picks up his aide, and drives to the Navy Department. The aide says that the Navy Department was like an anthill with the top kicked off it, on that day, the 9th of December, 1941. And he walks in, and the first thing he says is, "Where's Marshall?" King blames Marshall for Pearl Harbor throughout the remainder of the war, and that tension between the two of them is palpable. But even though King blames the Army for the disaster at Pearl Harbor, and more importantly, he gets very upset by the fact that the blame does end up going on Stark and Kimmel. King's like, how did Marshall get out of this? You know, they were able to set aside these deep differences during the course of the war. But there's a point in the book where I talk about 1943. They made a deal where the U.S. Navy would assume control over land-based liberators for anti-submarine work. The Army was sort of hoarding these aircraft and at the same time saying, "You're not doing enough to stop the U-boat menace." Well, King was like, "Well, give me those aircraft." Yeah, I can't do anything if you know. So they did strike a deal. Immediately after striking that deal, George Marshall issues a memo. It's called War Department Plan for Unification. And according to Leahy, King almost jumped across the table to strangle Marshall. Like, we're in the middle of a war, and you're trying to change the entire organization, and you know, meanwhile the British are trying to make us turn into the British, and it's just kind of a mess. So you know, this is why the book is the length that it is because these. You asked about air power. Air power is not about air power. It's not about air power. It's about procurement. It's about service. Future service, you know, is there going to be a Navy in the future? Who it was Bradley, General Bradley said there will never be another amphibious war. And of course, we end up in Korea, for God's sakes, you know, almost immediately. So yeah, air power it's a big problem in the historiography, but also it goes to what I said earlier about the popular image. I think for historians, we have to collectively identify opportunities to say that there's a myth here, or if it's not a myth, there's at least more to the story. And I think air power is one of those areas that I think historians have a lot more work to do for the future as we do. Let me just encapsulate it like this. I'll be very, very clear with this. Someday there's going to be a person born in Iowa. I'm from Iowa, Midwest. His name is going to be James T. Kirk. And his rank is going to be captain. That is a naval rank. So it's time to create Starfleet, I think.
Okay, I think we have one more. Okay, good, two more. Okay, two more. So here first and one back.
Okay. You talked a lot about Ernie's friends and everything else, but apart from what you said about Marshall, but a lot of people were pretty much implacable enemies of Ernie King. And
Oh yeah.
I'm thinking of Jack Fletcher after the disaster of Guadalcanal gets banished to the North Pacific, and Jack Towers, he sent him out to Pearl Harbor, but he never let him go to sea. Now, how do you reconcile that?
So I do talk about both of those specific cases in the book. Fletcher was broken.
Yeah.
He was worn out. For anybody who's been in combat, you know, in a combat area, just being in the area is wearing. And in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, I mean, the job really was to preserve the fleet and hit the enemy as best you can with what you have. And Fletcher was doing that. He did a pretty good job during that first sort of 6 months of the war in the Pacific. But, you know, after 6 months, he was spent. He was spent. And Chester Nimitz is one of these folks who didn't want to ruin anybody's career, but King finally ordered Nimitz to just give this guy a break. King did keep him up in Alaska. We forget about how important that front actually is. I mean, that's where a lot of the oil, the Canada oil pipeline was being built. I mean, it doesn't sound like an important front, but it's a hugely important front. In the Second World War context, sure, is it off the beaten path? Of course. But for anybody who's been in a war, wherever you are during that war, it's important. And Fletcher did a fine job and was rewarded, actually, at the end of the war, just like Joe Rochefort, who famously was removed from Station Hypo after Midway, which is also something I talk about in the book. They were reassigned to jobs that actually put them on a path to greater success, if you follow the chronology. Towers, nobody got along with Towers. Towers and Richmond Kelly, call sign Terrible Turner, those are both close associates of Ernest King. I do talk about their friendship, how close it was in the 1920s and 1930s. King knows these guys. And King is worried about Chester Nimitz's ability to make a decision, right? And Nimitz is always asking for more forces or more time, which is probably his job as an operational commander. But oftentimes Nimitz was susceptible, according to King, to being influenced in a bad way. So by 1942, the fall of 42, King is surrounding Nimitz with people who are going to keep Nimitz on track the way King wants him to stay on track. So when you do look at these personalities, by 1943-44 timeframe, you've got a real machine that has been developed to include the Anglo-American special relationship where we're sharing high-grade intelligence. That information is being disseminated through headquarters like the Commons headquarters, which is King, to the JICPAC headquarters, which is then being filtered out to the numbered fleets. But there's also a circuit that connects the individual task fleets, the numbered fleets, like the Third Fleet, Spruance, I'm sorry, that's Halsey, or Fifth Fleet, Spruance. They had numbered fleet intelligence officers who also had this connection to the Commons circuit. So by 1943-44, it's a different war, right? But these personalities are sort of moved around by King to keep sort of a fresh point of view going, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you talked about Fletcher being spent, but Mitchell was pretty spent by the.
Oh, yeah, and McCain,
Yeah.
all of these guys.
Okay, there's one at the back and then we'll go to the window. Okay, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor. I was blessed to work for Dave for a couple of years at the University of Naval College. One thing that I think Dave's been a little humble on in his book, I think he actually corrects the historiography about King being a womanizer and an alcoholic, and no one can actually figure out why he's in charge. It's a very good illumination. So there's a question there, and is Dave, could you talk a little bit more about how your records show that King in your book is different than King historiography?
Well, so thank you, Admiral, for that question. He did not work for me. I worked for him. Admiral Hartley. Thank you. So it's actually a hard question to answer. When you're talking about a human being as complex as Ernest King, there's different facets of the individual, just like all of us. He wasn't a perfect person in any way. But over the course of his 50-year career, he certainly understood the job, and he understood sea power. And I showed you the picture of the family. The family is still a very close-knit family. One of the things that I discovered, because the family shared not only the stuff that they still have in the family, but also recollections, firsthand recollections, I was able to get a different perspective, I think, than many other historians who've tried to tackle King. And was I captured by King a little bit? Sure. Did I get to know King really, really well? Yes, I did. I don't know how I feel about King. I do respect what he did, but I don't know that I necessarily want to go out for a beer with him. Unless, I was part of his inner circle. Once you were in his inner circle, then he took good care of it. Which is another sort of dynamic. It's that tribal culture, like I said. But I had to, in order to develop my understanding of King, I had to look at other sources beyond just those that you would normally think about. One of the sources that I thought about pretty intensely was Anne Briscoe Pye's manual called The Navy Wife. One of the things in the US Navy during King's time, if you married an American naval officer, the present that your husband would give to you is a manual called The Navy Wife. This is how you behave. And, it's a culture, so I did end up looking at King as being a lens for us to be able to sort of consider this foreign culture that doesn't exist anymore, really. I mean, bits and pieces of it do, but I did sort of attack King in the same way that an anthropologist would maybe sort of co-locate with the cannibal tribe and hopefully not be, become dinner.
Final question, I think,
Thanks very much. No, thank you for a fascinating talk. And I'm now wondering precisely how long my wife would let me live if I gave her a manual call. Minutes. You're very persuasive. On him getting on with everyone, I'm trying to think which book it is. Roskill said the first Sea Lord ordered him to kill King, and Roskill checked whether that was a serious order or, but I think a really interesting point about US naval tribal culture. And so my question is, why was it so slow and so inefficient in the use of merchant ships in the Second World War and convoys, and so slow to impose blockade against Japan when Brits were telling them to?
So it's easy for us to say that it's Ernest King's fault. When we do that, I think we don't recognize that King is not in charge of everything. He can't just pick up the phone and tell the mayor of Miami Beach to turn off the lights when German submarines are patrolling off the coast. He doesn't have that authority. In fact, it's the local authorities that have the power to do that. Even Franklin Roosevelt couldn't call the governor, or the mayor of New York City and say, "Hey, turn the lights off." It didn't work that way. So King doesn't have the power that a lot of historians have given King, right? And it's that period of 1942 that I think is really more complex than historians have really thought about. King has no control over coastal routing of shipping. He has no power to direct anybody to do anything. There's no organization really built up. The British do fly over and say, "This is how we do it," but the US Army said, "Well, okay, we'll do it that way too." US Navy is like, "Well, okay, we'll try this out, but it doesn't work in our system." And so it took time. The other thing I'll say is King was not, he was Commander-in-Chief US Fleet, which is, you're in charge of all the ships, but the Chief of Naval Operations was still Harold Stark. And he had a cloud over his head after Pearl Harbor, of course. It took a good 2 or 3 months to sort of negotiate that. And in the end, Stark was sent here to London because they were really trying to re-invoke that image of collaboration that had existed in World War I with Sims. And of course, Stark was here with Sims. He was part of the so-called London flagship over there on 30 Grosvenor Gardens. I just walked by it the other day. That's really the first American shore headquarters. That whole area became known as Little America. So when Stark returns in 1942, it's a big moment for Britain. It enhances morale. But the organization that develops over the course of the war by 1945, of course, is working perfectly. What we don't understand in the historiography is it can't work that way in 1942. Right? It's not, the infrastructure hasn't been built yet. The process and the command negotiation has only just begun, when Churchill arrives for Christmas in 1941, that's a big deal. I mean, we're all smiling for the cameras, but behind those closed doors, it's a knockdown it's like watching a wrestling match, you know, the British are saying, well, this is how you do things, and the Americans are like, we're not doing it that way, and it took time to develop the combined chiefs of staff, and then a month later, it was the joint chiefs of staff for the American side, and that was always an ad hoc organization. One of the things that I point out in the book, I know I'm sort of rambling here for the question, but Stark retained, if you look in this is important, you're a naval officer, so you understand lineal number, right? Stark was #1 in the Navy Register throughout World War II until the creation of the 5-star rank. So when Stark is sent to London, he is by lineal standing still the senior naval officer in the Navy. King is #2. Leahy's in retired status. So he's in an ex officio kind of status. He has no actual power, but he has Roosevelt's ear, right? King's immediate counterpart on the American staff is George Marshall. Hap Arnold is ex officio. So it's really two guys who have the formal authority to run the global war from an American point of view. And I had to spend a lot of time and effort to sort of reconstruct those food fights that did take place between the British and the Americans, and then of course behind the scenes between the Americans. Somebody asked the question about First Sea Lord wanting to shoot King.
So I mentioned that.
Was that you? Okay. So there is a moment where, first of all, it wasn't the First Sea Lord, it was Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, who said,
Also the first scene.
yeah. Ike is an interesting guy. In his book, At Ease, The Stories I Tell My Friends, he devotes 2 pages to his first experience with Ernest King. And Eisenhower was the head of planning for the Army staff, and King, you know, had to talk to Eisenhower about the torch landings, and they were coincidentally trying to plan some kind of operation in the Pacific to keep the Japanese fixed as far out as possible, and there was problems, and so Eisenhower went over to the Navy Department, and King asked for the meeting, King wouldn't meet with him. And so he sent a note out saying, do this and this and this, and Eisenhower said, well, somebody ought to shoot King. Well, then, as the plan develops, Eisenhower did meet with King, and King made him stand at attention for 10 minutes, which sounds ridiculous. I mean, if I were Eisenhower, I'd be getting really upset if I had to stand at attention for this guy. And then finally, Eisenhower said, well, sure, if you want to waste my time like this, I'm leaving. That's when King softened up and said, sit down. He's a tough character to deal with because he is all about posturing. But once he sort of once you've gained his trust, if you stand up to him, that's when King would sort of let his armor down a little bit. As I think about it, Eisenhower wrote, after that meeting, I knew I had a friend in the Navy Department. And it is Ernest King who, behind the scenes, sort of whispers in the ear that for the person to command Operation Overlord, it can't be Marshall. It's got to be Eisenhower, because Eisenhower knows how to deal with characters like Winston Churchill and all the other cast of characters over here in Britain. And of course, the politics of Overlord is a whole other book that we can talk about.
Let's move on. I'm going to say goodbye to our friends online, and then I'm going to leave the room, and I'm going to come back with a book. If you think you're not on the mailing list and you want to be for the King's Maritime History Seminars, then you can sign your name there, or rather leave a legible email address. Don't forget that Schiffer books are here, and there are more books than you see, so you can buy one while we wait for the next one that's coming. But while I do that, I hope we will do what we started to do, which is to thank